It's Brad here at eTrailer, and today we're taking a look at installing the eTrailer trailer hitch receiver on a 2021 Lincoln Aviator. Now this is what your hitch is going to look like when it's installed on your Aviator, and it's a really great option because you have a hidden cross tube, meaning the only thing that you're going to see visible when installed is going to be the receiver tube opening and the safety chain loops. And being that it's got this matte black powder coat finish, it actually matches really well with this bottom of our fascia, and that's something that's unique to the eTrailer hitch. It also holds up to chipping, scratching, and just rust and corrosion long term. Now the receiver tube opening being 2" by 2" is going to be a standard size, which is really nice when it comes to any accessories that you may load up, whether it be a ball mount, bike rack, or cargo carrier. And all of them are going to stay in place with a 5/8 pin and clip. Now this is not included with the hitch, but many of your accessories will come with one. And if you plan on leaving your accessories on your vehicle, you might want to look at a locking pin and clip. That way you can lock it in place and know that no one's going to walk away with your accessories. We also have a rolled style safety chain loop, nice and open there. So if you're planning on pulling a trailer and you hook up safety chains, if you have an S-hook or even a larger clevis style, no problem hooking up. And as far as weight capacities and towing, this has some pretty good numbers. The gross trailer weight rating, which is the weight of the trailer plus the accessories loaded up, is 6,000 pounds, and that's pretty good. You also have a tongue weight rating of 600 pounds, and that's going to be your bike racks and cargo carriers, things that are going to be suspended generally. And with 600 pounds, you can load up a cargo carrier pretty well, a 4-bike rack, really with no problem. But if you are planning on towing, double check the vehicle's owner's manual, see what it's capable of towing, and then compare that with the hitch as well as any of the components you'll be using, and take the lowest number out of all of those. That way you're not overloading anything. Some accessories like cargo carriers and bike racks will stow in a vertical position, and you do want to make sure that you have clearance to do that. So measuring from the center of our hitch pin hole to the furthest point of our rear fascia, we're going to be coming in right about 3 inches. So I don't worry too much that you're going to have any issues with those folding up. Just keep in mind you're probably not going to be able to open up your rear hatch in that stowed configuration. Now ground clearance is also going to be important, and this one's fairly decent at 15 inches. It's going to be mostly important for determining a rise or drop necessary for your ball mount. So with that measurement, you can measure from the ground to the bottom of the coupler of your trailer, compare that with our measurement, and then you can determine that rise or drop necessary. Something else that I'll point out is any suspended accessories like your cargo carriers and bike racks extend the length of your vehicle. So as you go up sharp, or really steep inclines, it does have that potential to bottom out. I don't think you'll be too concerned with it, but if something is really steep or if you're on rocky or rough terrain, you might want to just keep that in mind while having those accessories loaded on. Now we get a lot of questions, especially on SUVs that have the hands-free liftgate or kick sensor, whatever you want to call it. Will it still work with this hitch in place? And you can see key fob in hand here pretty easily. Yes, it still does work. Now with that being said, we did have to do some trimming to get space on our fascia, and you do get pretty close to the kick sensor panel. So you do need to be careful there. You're also going to be trimming some heat shields that require the exhaust to come down. So as far as installation goes, this one has quite a few steps that are maybe a little bit more intense than some other hitch installs. None of it's particularly hard, but you are going to be doing some riveting and drilling out of factory rivets. So if this is something that you watch and decide, maybe this isn't for me, maybe you don't have the place to do it, the tools, or even the want to do it, you can use our dealer locator to find someone close to you to get it installed. But if you're a DIYer and you're doing this at home, follow along. I'm going to make sure that you get your hitch installed. So let's take a look at that. To begin our installation, you're going to want to check and see if your vehicle has an underbody panel. If that's the case, there's going to be a few instructions to follow along with the manual to get that removed. Ours does not have one, so we can move on to the next step, which is going to be lowering down the exhaust. Before we even start to lower it, we want to support it to make sure that our exhaust isn't going to get damaged upstream. And the best way to do that, since we're on a lift, I'm using a cam buckle strap, but if you're doing this at home or in your driveway, you can just put a block of wood or a box or something to just support the weight. So I'll just make a cradle. And the isolators that we're going to be tackling, we have 2 of them that are right behind the rear cross member, and then there's also going to be 2 of them that are located up by the front of the muffler. We'll start by getting the isolators taken down on the muffler side, and these ones have a metal bracket that's bolted into the frame rail, so instead of prying those out of the rubber, we're going to just grab the isolator and just work your way up and you'll feel a 10mm bolt head. So we'll get that taken down. And as we remove hardware, I recommend having a nice organized spot to keep it all. That way reinstallation becomes that much easier. Now once you pull out those bolts, you're going to want to lift up. There's a tab that's located on the bracket that just holds into the frame. So just lift that up and then rotate this out, and that should get this muffler loose. We'll do the same thing on the other side. For our isolators that are located by the cross member, this is going to be a little bit different. A long flathead screwdriver or a pry bar is going to be used to just pry this off. You can use the exhaust as leverage, just catch on that back side and then slide this off. Now, many times you're going to have these kind of want to be almost adhered to the metal. So what I recommend doing is if you have a little silicone spray or even soapy water to just lubricate that, it's going to make it a lot easier to not only pop them off, but also put them back in place later. With our cam buckle strap, I'm just going to bump this down a little bit. And the main thing is we're gaining access to our heat shield. We're going to be removing that with just a series of 10mm nuts as well as some bolts. Just get all of the ones that are on the frame and the underside. So the first ones we're going to tackle are going to be here on the frame rail. Those are going to be 10mm, the same with the one towards the middle and straight back. There's also one that goes on this beam across. The other two on the outside of the vehicle we'll tackle a little bit later, but we're going to do the same process on both sides. So go ahead, get all those 10mm removed. And the remaining hardware that we need to take down is going to be the 7mm screw that's located right above the muffler. There's also one that's by the wheel well. It's also a 7mm, so we'll get those removed. We can pull down our heat shields on both sides, and we're going to be trimming them. So we will be putting them back up, but we need to make space for all of the hardware to go up. These are, kind of pressed on those studs pretty well. So if you need to, I would use either a flathead screwdriver or a trim panel tool to kind of wedge underneath there and work it out until you get it removed. But a little downward pressure will help it along. Now you may need to give it a little bit of tugging to get this to pop out. Now I've marked out both of our heat shields of where we're going to trim, and basically what we're going to be doing is making an access hole right here above where that stud was, but it's in line with this factory hole, and that's going to become where we put hardware. So it doesn't have to be spot on. As long as it's going to be open enough for us to get our hardware in place, that's going to be fine. And then this long strip is going to be for the hitch, or the sides of it to rest. So to cut this out, you can use a pair of snips for a lot of it. You can use a Dremel, angle grinder, whatever you may have. I'm going to use a combo of tin snips on the long section. And then for that hole, just to make it easier, I have a hole saw here. You don't have to have one of these. As long as you make that hole, it can be a square, it can be a circle, doesn't really matter. We just need access for that hardware. So be careful. Heat shields, especially when cut, are very sharp. So just make sure that you're not going to do anything to cut your hands in the process. But we'll just go through and get this all trimmed out on both sides. If you want to, on any of those raw edges, if it seems like something you're going to catch your hands on, if you want to run a file on it, by all means. Now we also need to make room for the hitch by removing this factory bolt that's in the frame rail, and it's going to require a 21mm socket to do that. We're going to have one on each side. So get that knocked loose. You might have to give it a little bit of effort here. There we go. And we'll take these out on both sides. Now once you get those bolts out, we are not going to be reinstalling these, so you can either hold on to them or discard them. We still need to make sure that we have access for our hitch to slide up, and part of that's going to be trimming out our fascia just to account for the receiver tube opening. But before we do that, if you have a kick sensor or hands-free liftgate The wiring for that runs along here, so we want to make sure that we're not damaging that in the process. And the first step that we're going to be doing is drilling out the rivets. These attach to an underbody plastic, so if we can get that separated, then we can safely get our kick sensor out of the way and start trimming. And we do have replacement rivets in the kit, so we are going to drill these out. I would grab a drill bit that's slightly larger than that center metal section, and then just slowly start on it. Normally once you kind of get a portion started, you can drill right through, and that whole rivet should come with it. So as you can see, as I went through it, that whole cap came out. Sometimes it'll come along with the drill bit. That's totally okay, but we'll get the remaining 3 drilled out. I'm going to be removing 2 screws. You're going to find that there's a 7mm, and this is attaching part of this plastic to the fascia, and so we want to remove that. That's going to give us a little bit more room to work. There's 1 on each side, so we'll get these taken out. With that separated, you can peel this back, and this will make sure that you don't cut anything above this plastic. So if you need to, you can put some rolled up paper towels or something to kind of keep a gap, or just pull this out and just make sure you don't hit anything behind as you trim. Now you can use any cutting method that you like. I'm going to use a multi-tool, and we'll get this trimmed out according to the measurements in the instruction manual. And the kick sensor sits in this area, and if you're concerned that you're going to make contact with it, you can actually pry it out of that. It's just basically the large diameter wire, and that pops out if you need to. It's fairly easy to do. So if you peel this back, you'll find the end on the driver's end. You can just simply pop this out, and this is a guarantee to where we're not going to make damage to our kick sensor. I don't know if you need. As you can see, me just pushing this back far enough allows me to cut this out safely. So now we can go ahead and get this trimmed. Took my tape off, and with everything cut out, I'm just going to run a file back and forth on here to clean up any edges. This is definitely what you're going to potentially see with the hitch in place. So just take a little bit of time here, make it look nice and clean. We're going to be putting our hardware in the frame rail for our hitch to bolt up to. So on each side, grab 2 fish wires, 2 spacer blocks, and 2 carriage bolts. And if you've never done a fish wire technique, it's not particularly difficult, but this will allow us to get this up into the frame. And something I'll recommend is leave the pull wires on the hardware as we pull them through. So the first thing we'll do is find that this hole is going to be a little bit larger. So we'll start on this back or forwardmost hole, I guess you'd say. Take the coiled end and feed that up towards this larger hole in the middle. And if you want, you can put a bend on this tail end so it doesn't pull all the way through. We'll then grab our spacer block and carriage bolt. And spacer block you could just simply feed into the frame rail. And our carriage bolt we thread onto our pull wire. And that should slide right in there. Bring this down until we get that carriage bolt to drop down. So once you get to this state, leave it here. And then for this hole, it's going to be a reverse fish wire technique, but it's pretty simple. Take our spacer block and just kind of hold this with our fingers, thread on our carriage bolt. Feed this into that access hole as well as that spacer block, and then we can drop that down. At this point, we'll just repeat those same steps on the other side. We need to get our heat shield put back up, and this should account for where we made those new holes for the new hardware. So make sure that it feeds in there no problem, and we'll just bolt this up. You can also go ahead and do those outer bolts that were on the wheel well, but we'll get these both bolted up in place. So as you feed this in, you're going to want to take your pull wires and the rearmost one, put through that opening, and then the hole that we made will be the forwardmost one. That's why the bends on the pull wires, it does make it a little bit easier to kind of keep that in place as we raise this back up. As you put this back up, I mentioned that this should line up, but also the edge of our heat shield should sit pretty much on the edge of the frame rail. You know, that's just going to allow for that hitch to go up. So if it's not perfect, this is going to be a little bit flexible, so not to worry, but just make sure that you're aligned fairly close. You're going to probably want an extra set of hands. This is a large hitch, and it's kind of awkward to get up there, especially because what we're going to want to do is take our pull wires and feed them through the forwardmost holes as we slide this up over the exhaust. Now you're also going to want to have the large bolt and washer on hand on each side, and that way we can get this started. It'll help support our hitch. So as we feed this in, we'll slide our hitch back kind of behind the fascia, and if you need to peel that back to gain access, by all means do that. But as we raise this up, get our pull wires pulled out. We're going to line that hole. We'll then take our large bolt and that washer and get that started. Just a few threads. And once you get that started on one side, you get the other side, the hitch will hold itself up. Okay. Now with those large bolts installed, we should have a little bit of our carriage bolts passed down. And if they're not completely down, just kind of jostle this around until they drop. But it's going to be hard to get this thread started. So you can tighten this large bolt up a little bit just by hand. And that's going to draw it up a little bit further, allowing us to get our pull wire taken off. And it's very important we don't push it back up in the frame rail. So what you can do is take the pull wire, slide it on the threads, and that may hold that in position enough to where you can at least start one or two of the threads on your serrated flange bolts. And once it's kind of started like that, you can just thread this on, and then we'll just repeat for the remaining hardware. Now before we get too far, you know, before tightening everything down, I am going to get my kick sensor in place here. And so we still should have a little bit of that plastic up top for us to snap it back in place. And then if you need to, that fascia is still loose. You can move that accordingly. But once you get the kick sensor put back in place, we'll also go ahead and get these small bolts in place. We'll head back to our hitch, and I'm going to snug these all down. The hardware that you're going to be using, or the sockets, is the 15/16 on the rearmost hole for the larger bolts as we see here. And then the smaller conical tooth washers are going to be a 3/4. Now don't get crazy here, because we're going to come back with a torque wrench. We'll get them all properly torqued down, but this is a good way to just cinch that up. Now with our torque wrench, we are going to have two different torque settings based on the hardware, so make sure you're counting for that. Now if you need a torque wrench, we have them available here at eTrailer. You can generally go to an auto parts store and rent one for free. This is going to be important though, because long term you want your hitch to be strong enough to stay in place, but also not too tight, putting any stress on hardware. We've officially installed our hitch, but we need to get our exhaust put back in place, as well as the exhaust isolators bolted up, and then I'll show you how to use plastic rivets to get this put back in place. For getting plastic rivets in, using a rivet gun is definitely the best way to do it, and this is a plastic rivet gun. You can use a regular one, it'll work just fine. But if you don't have one, I'll show you another option. But essentially the way a rivet works is you slide this through the holes that we originally had, and then as we pull this, it acts kind of like a wall anchor. It'll compress that down and then break off this end. So slide your rivet gun up, pull, reseat it, and one more should pop that off, and then get that attached. Now if you don't have a rivet gun, you can get away if you hold this in place. A lot of times if I use a box end of a socket to hold that in, you can use pliers to pull that down. So I'll show you how to do that. So just at that box end holding that plastic up, I just take my pliers, pull this down, and then go back at it again, It should break off that end. You can feel that the back is already pressed in pretty well. I don't think it's going to be loose. So you can go ahead, you can snap this off or break it off like that, and it'll work just the same. You've officially installed your eTrailer trailer hitch receiver on your 2021 Lincoln Aviator.